Hi, I want to talk to you in this video about Plato's Republic. Plato in the Republic, which is one of the middle dialogues, seems to me to move significantly away from the Socratic view of virtue, and to a very different kind. Now, the Republic itself is a long book. It's a work of political philosophy, as well as metaphysics, epistemology, and the philosophy of mind. And so what we're going to be talking about here is just one small part of one book in the Republic. It's a part that has to do with the philosophy of mind and also with ethics, and in particular with the question of temptation, or as philosophers think of it, weakness of will. There's a term in Greek, akrasia, which means something like weakness of will, giving in to temptation. And we want to know whether it's possible, and if so, what it is. On Socrates' analysis, it is not possible. After all, he thinks in the end that virtue is knowledge, that vice is ignorance. And so, could we be weak of will? What is weakness of will, anyway? I've said that it's giving in to temptation. The definition that the Roman poet Ovid gives is it's knowing the better and doing the worse. It's knowing what you ought to do and not doing it. Well, if that's what it is, knowing the better, doing the worse, knowing what you ought to do, but not doing it, then we could say that there's a gap between knowledge and action, and a gap, therefore, between knowledge and virtue. After all, we don't want to say the person who runs away from battle is courageous. We don't want to say that the person who gives in to temptation and, in fact, exhibits a lust for power, for example, is self-controlled. And so, action seems to matter here, but knowledge seems purely internal. And so we could say, look, if virtue is knowledge, then it looks like these people would have to be called virtuous. But plainly, they are not. Plainly, there's some kind of gap between knowledge, which is internal, and then action and virtue, which involves at least something external. So it looks as if, anyway, people can give in to temptation. They can turn out not to be self-controlled in a situation. They can be weak of will. And so, how do we account for that? Plato, in part, I think, is saying to Socrates, look, it sure looks like people can give in to temptation, that they can be weak-willed, they can know the better and do the worse. We need to understand how that's possible. Well, I think Socrates does have something that could be said here. We're pretty bad at judging short and long-term goods, and usually when people give in to temptation, that's what's at stake. I think about my long-term health, but then think, but that piece of chocolate cake looks really good, and I give in to temptation and have it. The question of what that does to my waistline and my health, that's a long-term consideration. The pleasure of eating the cake is a short-term consideration. And if you think about all sorts of cases where people give in to temptation, it feels like that's the kind of issue we face, judging some short-term good against some long-term good. And Socrates can say, we're pretty bad at making those decisions. What we need is knowledge of what's truly better there, but it's hard to gain that knowledge, especially, you might say, when there is something immediate that is pressing on us through the senses. We tend to give in to that immediate thing and, in short, overvalue the short term as opposed to the long term. But that's not because we're just bad people or because there's some weird metaphysical gap between knowledge and action. Socrates could say that's just because we don't know how to compare the short term to the long term. We make lots of mistakes. Plato doesn't think that's the right analysis. He says, when I'm facing a situation of temptation, it sure doesn't feel like I need knowledge, like it's in some way analogous to the person on the game show saying, ooh, should I select what's behind door number 1 or door number 2? No, it doesn't feel like that at all. I feel as if I'm at war with myself. I feel torn apart. I feel as if I'm being pulled in 2 different directions. Now, maybe not when I'm just thinking about the piece of cake. Maybe it's not that serious. But in other more serious situations, he says, that's what it feels like. I feel the temptation, and I feel drawn toward that thing, but I'm also resisting. And that's uncomfortable. There's a tension there. There's a fight going on within me. And that doesn't feel like just a, I don't know what to do here. That feels like something much more serious. So in effect, Plato is saying Socrates gets the phenomenology of this kind of conflict wrong. Anyone who is in a situation of psychological conflict is not simply like the person who doesn't know what to do and needs more information. They feel at war with themselves. They are torn apart. And we need to explain that sense of being pulled in different directions. So, That's what Plato is trying to do. Give us an analysis that not only shows that weakness of will is possible, that you really can give in to temptation and have that be a moral failing, not merely an epistemic failing, but also understand how that happens and why we have such a strong feeling of conflict when it does. Plato's conclusion from analyzing cases like this is somewhat surprising. He says there are 3 different parts of the soul. How does he get to that conclusion? There's a very straightforward argument. Premise 1. The same thing clearly cannot act or be acted upon in the same part or in relation to the same thing at the same time in contrary ways. Internally, you might say, a thing has a tendency to do this or a tendency to do that. If I drop an object, it tends to fall or it tends to rise, depending on what it is. Maybe it's a helium balloon and it tends to rise. Maybe it's something heavier than air and it tends to fall. But it's going to be one or the other. It doesn't have both tendencies at the same time. Anyway, that's his thought. We can't have the same thing pulled in different directions at once. Second premise, assent and dissent, desire and aversion, attraction and repulsion are opposites. That seems plausible enough. If I want something and I have an aversion to it, those seem like opposite attitudes. If I assent to something and dissent, seems like those are opposite reactions, so this seems entirely plausible. Third, so let's take a case. If you suppose something which pulls a thirsty soul away from drink, that must be different from the thirsty principle, which draws him like a beast to drink. So suppose I am thirsty, I want something to drink, but for some reason I don't want to drink that. Let's say I'm shipwrecked at sea and I'm on a raft, and I really am thirsty. I really want to drink the water that's around me, but I'm aware that it's salt water, and it is not going to help me to drink that water. So one part of me is drawn toward that. Another part of me is saying, no, do not drink that water. And here's the point. Given that assumption that I can't have both tendencies at the same time and the same way, tells me there must be 2 different things in me, one of which is attracted to drinking that water, the other of which is saying, no, don't do it, has an aversion to it. Is it possible for someone to be thirsty but unwilling to drink? Yes, of course. Therefore, there must be something in us that is bidding us in this example to drink, and another thing that is forbidding us to drink. That seems to be the case in any case of psychological conflict. Plato's point is that if you feel conflicted, that tells you there is something in your soul, something in your mind, something in you that is pulling you toward one action, and then another that is pushing you away from that action, or maybe toward a contrary action. So in short, in a case of conflict, there must be 2 things in you, 2 elements, 2 faculties, 2 parts, one of which has the desire, the other of which has the aversion, one of which assents, the other dissenting from the action or from the proposition. Well, what are these conflicts like? Plato says the typical one is simply between desire and reason. You're thirsty, you want to drink that water around you, but reason is saying it's salt water. It will not help you. It will actually make you thirstier and make you sicker. It'll make you worse off. Don't do it. And in that case, it is a desire for drink as opposed to reason saying it would be bad for you. Don't do it. He thinks that's typical. That's what happens in most of these cases of conflict. So that would lead us to say there are 2 parts of the soul, reason and desire. And indeed, some philosophers end up with 2 parts of the soul for just that reason. In fact, Aristotle talks primarily about rational and irrational parts of the soul. In Paul, there's a distinction between the flesh and the spirit. And so you might think all we need is that 2-part idea. Whenever there's a conflict, one part is pulling one way, one part is pulling the other way. But Plato doesn't think that's enough. That's typical, but he says there can be other things going on, other kinds of conflict. So he gives us an example. The story is that Leontius, the son of Aglion, coming up one day from the Piraeus under the north wall on the outside, observed some dead bodies lying on the ground at the place of execution. He felt a desire to see them, and also a dread and abhorrence for them. For a time he struggled and covered his eyes. But at length the desire got the better of him, and forcing them open, he ran up to the dead bodies, saying, "Look, ye wretches, take in your fill of this fair sight." Well, it's a disgusting story. But on the other hand, it's something that most of us have experienced, seeing a dead animal, let's say, on the side of the road. And here's Plato's point. There's a real conflict there. Part of you wants to look. Part of you does not want to look. But it has nothing to do with reason. Reason isn't intervening, saying it is not good for you to look or it is good for you to look. It has nothing to do with the rational part of your soul at all. So what is happening? Here is the moral as Socrates in the dialogue draws it out. Anger at times goes to war with desire, as if they're two distinct things. In short, he says it's anger versus desire. The desire to look at the bodies, but then an anger at yourself for wanting to look at them. Saying, no, that's really... Now, I think we could analyze this in different ways. It feels as if that anger, the emotional reaction here, is part of it. Part of it may be that you want to look, but you also really don't want to look. You know it's going to be disgusting, and part of you says, don't look, don't look. And it's not so much that reason is telling you, you will have an unpleasant reaction, do not look. It's more like there's something about the appearance of this itself that repels you, and yet something that attracts you too. I think certain kinds of works of art are like this. There may be TV shows or movies that are so bad you don't want to watch, but you kind of do. This sort of thing can happen, but then you can feel disgusted at yourself for wanting to see this. And so he says, look, some element of this, at any rate, is anger fighting desire. You can feel the desire for something, and you feel angry at yourself for wanting it, and reason has nothing to do with it at all. So the point is, we need a third part of the soul. There is reason, there is desire, but there's also emotion, the spirited element, as he puts it, in addition to the appetitive element, desire, and the rational element, reason. If that's true, then there can be actually, well, 3 different kinds of conflict. But before we get to that point, let's think about the argument here, because it seems like there's an obvious counter-argument. What about that third leg of it, that third kind of conflict? Is it true that reason and emotion can come into conflict? And we'd expect Plato to say yes, and to start giving us some examples. Instead, he says something surprising. He says, no, actually, they don't come into conflict. Now, it might be, as he puts it, that they are often allied, but at some points he says, actually, no, I mean they always are allied. Reason always goes together with emotion. And that's a surprising claim. What? They can't come into conflict at all? Well then, if that's true, why not simply identify them? Say that actually reason and emotion come to the same thing. Or maybe they're so closely intertwined, they're really one part of the soul that has sometimes rational and sometimes emotional expressions. He doesn't say that. And his argument for it is, well, look at children. They have emotions, but they don't yet have reason, and so that shows you can have emotion without reason, so they can't be the same part. I at least don't find that a very compelling argument at all. After all, it could be that they are something like the plant and the flower. Maybe emotion is like the plant, and it takes it a while to flower, but eventually it flowers in this case, reason. Well, it would still be part of the same thing, right? It would be the same part of the soul, sometimes manifested as the underlying plant, that's the first thing, but eventually maturing into the flower. Emotion's still there, so sometimes we see the flower, sometimes we see just the plant, sometimes we see both. That would be enough, right? So it doesn't seem that that's adequate. But there is something else that should make us wonder about all of this. Plato goes on then to give an example. There's a quotation from Homer, and that quotation in context makes it clear that, wait, this is precisely a case of reason coming into conflict with emotion. So here's the case. The quotation from Homer is this: "We may once more appeal to the words of Homer, which have already been quoted by us. He smote his breast and thus rebuked his soul." In this verse, Homer has clearly supposed the power which reasons about the better and worse to be different from the unreasoning anger which is rebuked by it. Well, yes, he does, but notice what's happening in that passage. Reason is rebuking anger. There's a conflict between them. It's not just one without the other. No, reason is saying, don't do it. Now, here's the context. It's in Book 20 of the Odyssey. Odysseus has come back home finally, but he's still disguised. He has not revealed his identity to Telemachus or to Penelope. And he's observed that his house is overrun with these suitors, these guys who want to marry the woman who is still his wife, even though he's been gone for 10 years and presumed dead. What really angers him is that at night he sees them bringing in a group of women, presumably prostitutes, for their own amusement. And he's outraged. So what? You're doing this under my own roof? This is ridiculous. He is furious. But he knows at that point he has no plan. He wants to kill them all. He feels so angry. He thinks, I'm going to get rid of them. I'm going to drive them out of there. But he realizes there are a bunch of them. I don't have a plan. And so reason says, look, cool it. Rest. Figure out a plan. How are you, one person, going to take on that crowd? You better know what you're doing. You better have a plan. And so he waits. But notice what's happening there. He is driven by anger to want to do something, and he is restrained by reason. That is anger at war with reason. Reason having to exercise its control over anger. That suggests that there can be conflicts between the rational part of the soul and the spirited element. And that's not so surprising. Look, that happens all the time. You can have an emotional reaction, but reason can say, look, that's not an appropriate emotional reaction. Or at any rate, don't act on that now. Yes, you're angry at what's just been said, but it's really important that you close this deal, so don't pay attention. Or, yes, your teacher has just said something that annoys you, but you're trying to get a good grade in the course, keep your mouth shut. Whatever happens here, there is reason exercising control over emotion. There is a conflict between emotion and reason. And of course that can happen in other contexts. You may fall in love with somebody that your reason tells you is not good for you. So we can have all sorts of cases where there appears to be just that kind of conflict. It is puzzling that Plato doesn't just say that, but he's concerned not to say it because he wants reason to have an ally. He uses in the Phaedrus the following example. He says the soul is like a chariot. Reason is in the driver's seat, but we've got two horses. One horse is rather unruly. It goes where it wants to go, or at least it's striving to. That is the appetitive element, desire. The other horse is noble and of noble breed, and it tends to do what it ought to do. That's emotion. And so the idea is that usually emotion is an ally of reason and helps reason direct the chariot to where it ought to go. And it does make a certain amount of sense. If I think something's unjust, I'm likely to become angry about it. If I think that something is owed, then I will have an emotional response that directs me toward it, and I will feel guilty if I don't. So the idea of feeling shame, feeling guilt, or feeling proud of myself for having done something I think was a good thing, we've got cases here all over the place of emotion helping reason, and reason helping emotion too. I mean, some psychologists think it's really emotion that's driving the chariot and that reason is making up reasons, essentially rationalizing what emotion is doing anyway. But either way, we've got an alliance that is typical. But we don't have to say it's universal, even if it is typical. Sometimes, after all, we lose these battles, and if we always had the alliance of emotion, if it were always two against one in these cases of conflict, you might think, how does desire ever win? How do we ever exhibit weakness of will? Why do we ever give in to temptation? Well, suppose we want to fortify ourselves and try to make us more resistant to temptation. What do? Socrates says, gain knowledge, and in particular gain knowledge of how to compare the short-term and long-term goods that tend to come into conflict. Plato says something different. Strengthen reason. Strengthen emotion, but especially strengthen reason, and try to learn how to control those desires. So you've got to put reason clearly in charge. Now, each of the horses has a role to play. It's not as if you want to completely suppress desire or suppress emotion. The ideal here is not Sherlock Holmes, who suppresses emotion completely. The ideal is rather to have them do what they ought to do. Indeed, look, if the horses aren't there, the chariot goes nowhere. So desire and emotion are what impels us, what gives us energy, what pushes us toward action. But it has to be restrained by reason. We have to make sure that reason is in control. And that is the key to both virtue and happiness, Plato says.